total silence. Total silence. And then when the reviews came out, there was one in the Los Angeles Times, a paper to which I've contributed, where the man basically began with a quote from Richard Hofstadter about the paranoid mind. And I believe he misrepresented Hofstadter anyway, and whatever you think or care about Hofstadter is another matter. But this was supposed to tell people, and he actually says in the review, whatever you do, do not read this book. And I actually saw online things where people said, you know, after reading that review, I think I won't read this book. And I would think if some guy you didn't know said, do not read this book, you, like a child, would do the exact opposite, right? Where's the cookie jar, you know? So this was amazing to me. And he actually said that I obviously was a nut because there was anybody who did not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone did not deserve a place at the table of civilized discourse. Well, I thought, well, that's interesting because like 80% of Americans don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And the House Select Committee on Assassinations, I mean, we know the House of Representatives is not really edgy. They concluded a probable conspiracy, though they couldn't figure out who was behind it. So this is what has happened. This is the challenge, and this is one of the reasons that we're getting the word out in a kind of a guerrilla manner through the grassroots. Family of Secrets began when I started wondering in 2004 about what had happened to America. I won't go into this whole story, but I was living abroad. I was training investigative journalists in the former Yugoslavia. The run-up to the invasion of Iraq began. I could see, to my own satisfaction, that they were rushing this, that they had predetermined they wanted to do this, and that they were putting up evidence that supported something rather than having fairly considered whether this was the right course or was even necessary. And so as I lived in Europe, I noticed this sea change where people were having increasing animosity toward Americans, all Americans, and toward me. And I was used to, if you travel around the world generally, people love Americans because they've heard all those great things about this is the best country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And so here was this tremendous animosity. And I thought, well, what had changed so much? And so I went back to the United States in early 2004, and I thought, how do people get in power? How did this guy, George W. Bush, I mean, let's face it, I mean, anybody in this room was probably better qualified to be president than he was. Will somebody give me, you know, the 15-minute warning or something, because I have no idea how long I've been going on here. Okay. You know, and this is just from his own friends. And when I started working on this book and I would travel to people, they would all kind of chuckle. They thought this was the biggest joke imaginable. That their buddy and the ne'er-do-well, this and that, and there he, boy, wasn't that something. But, you know, they were used to that because they'd all, you know, gotten into the best schools through legacies and things like that, and they'd all gotten jobs through their wives or girlfriend's father, and they'd gotten inside tips to trade stocks and make money, and, you know, everything came to them pretty easily, so this seemed like the normal course of democracy. And so I thought, well, gee, you know, I just wonder if there's anything more to this story of this country and where we've gotten to. And by the way, there was this thing called 9/11, which sort of kind of came and went, and it was this amazing, huge story, but there was no explanation for this thing, not a proper one. And then there was the invasion of Iraq, and there was no proper explanation for that because the reasons they gave clearly turned out to be false. So I thought, well, boy, I mean, everything turns out to be false. I mean, what's going on here? Who are these people? You know, are we in the Truman Show? Remember that movie where the guy discovers his whole life is a movie and everybody around him are hired actors and he's, you know, being manipulated for the show? You start wondering, you know, what is the reality here? And so I thought, you know, I'm just going to poke around in the bushes and see if there's anything with all those books that have been written that could possibly have been missed. And do you know what? You can take any subject, no matter how well covered it is, and you find out they didn't even begin to scratch the surface. So how and why did Bush become president and do what he did? Well, what did he do? I mean, the moment he was in office, he began doing all these strange things. This is before 9/11. He began doing things that are typical of a police state. And I wrote pieces for The Nation magazine and other places, Slate and so forth, about all these curious things and lockdowns of records and prior presidential records and trying to prevent the Freedom of Information Act from operating properly. These were all the kind of things you would expect, again, from a Pinochet, not from the President of the United States. So I thought, well, this is weird. These are sort of police state tendencies. And then there were these corporatist influences where they suddenly had this idea that the job of the EPA was to hire everybody from every chemical company in America and cancel all the laws. And again, I mean, if any of you have read, for example, Naomi Klein's excellent Shock Doctrine, where she talks about that this is deliberate. This is a philosophy that is actually acknowledged that the only way they can get what they want to create shocks, tremendous shocks to the system that are so traumatizing and convulsive that anything can be instituted right after that. And of course, you know what happened after 9/11. Constant those alerts. Remember those alerts? And they always came right before an election, and they were never about anything. People in the FBI complained and said, these are not even legitimate. We don't want to put these things out. I remember living in New York City. They used to, I don't know if they do it anymore, you suddenly would see a ton of police cars just, you know, going in a convoy. Have you heard about that? It turns out that is an exercise to shock. They want people to pay attention, and so they practice these things, and it's not clear what that's for, but it just terrifies everybody. So I thought, well, this is just very interesting. And so I began looking at the Bush family, and I started looking at W, and I said, how does a guy like him become president? And how and why did huge amounts of money from supposedly the smartest people in this country bet on this particular guy instead of, let's say, you know, a kind of a Bob Dole-ish type figure who's at least an intelligent and accomplished guy, whether you agree with him or not? Why this particular person? And the more I looked at W, the more I saw that there was some sense of him as something, part of something larger, a kind of a continuity, if you will, that he represented an ongoing mission. It wasn't so much that anybody really liked him personally. And moreover, as I looked at him, I saw that there were all these things about his past that were so problematical that if they ever came out, he never could have been elected in 2000, and he certainly never would have been reelected in 2004. One of those you know about was his military service. I mean, he just took off. He just stopped serving in the military during a war. Now, you would think a man who was president of the United States, who then started a war that turned out to be under false pretenses, if you learned in the middle of that war that he himself had skipped out of another war and lied about it, that would maybe be a good story. Silly me, that maybe the media, you know, they did for like a month, to be fair, and I go into this chapter and verse in Family of Secrets, for about a month, national media tried, somewhat flaccidly, but they tried to kind of look into this stuff. And the White House just ran circles around them. They were just much cleverer about it, and they stopped them. And then you had the Swift Boat Veterans for the Truth, whose website was put up by this guy who worked for Karl Rove, who later died in a plane crash, and, you know, on and on and on. I mean, a lot of effort goes into psychological operations. And you talk to anybody who's at any high level in the military, in intelligence, and frankly, in any institution, any corporation or anything, psychological operations are crucial. In other words, you want, when you work for a big bank, you want to figure out how to convince people that the bank really cares about you. Well, we know the bank doesn't care about them at all, but yet that's what they tell them. That's psychological operations. And so psychological operations are an important part of what goes on in our country in the power process, and it's something we don't cover. We don't talk about that. Okay, I usually talk about, well, just briefly to touch on the revelations, the more I looked at George W., the more I saw there had been a cover-up of his military service, that a decision had been made that if this comes out, his career is ruined, and not just his career, but probably his family, and his family was now, it was the third or fourth generation that was a political dynasty. And then I found the fingerprints of his father, and that his father seemed to, I wondered why the father, you know, who was already a major figure in Washington, did he not know during a war that his son had just taken off? I mean, did he not ask him when they got together, as they often did? And so I began looking at the father, and I discovered that the father seemed like he did know, and the father seemed like he had somehow helped cover up this thing. And then I thought, well, that's very interesting, because I thought the father and the son hated each other. You remember that? That's what everybody thinks, the father and the son. And in the last few years, everybody says, gee, you know, I sure miss H.W.